Welcome to the Trouble with Writing podcast, where we chat about the real issues that stop multilingual writers producing effective English and see where we can help.
Hello guys, how are you both doing?
Hello everyone, happy to be back, ready for another good discussion.
Yeah, when was our last discussion?
I think we missed a month there.
It's been a while. We're slowing down a bit, but we're still trying to finish up season 2. I guess this is episode 10 of season 2, so I hope I've got that right.
We've got an interesting topic today. Shall we jump right in?
Yeah, let's do that.
So this is a question we have to address today. How can second language writers master readability to boost job prospects? And what do you guys think of this question? What's your experience with this question? How does this appear in your work?
I think as with any question, I would start by trying to define things. So listeners and viewers are probably thinking, well, what do you mean by readability? And how does that connect to job prospects? So I guess let's answer those two questions first, right? Maybe I'll throw it over to Pete. What is readability for you?
Yeah, I would definitely start with saying readability is very simply something that is easy to read. What would you add to that, Phil or Paul?
I'd add three things, like how to define how something is easy to read. I guess we'll get into that when we get a bit more technical in a minute. The other things I would say that are worth a mention are who's reading it and where they're reading it. So whether something is easy to process as text depends on who the audience is. Is it designed to be highly readable for 5th grade school children or academic experts? And where are we reading this? Is it in a physical book? Is it scrolling on a social media feed? Is it a caption under a video or something? You know, it depends on what the type of writing is, where we're going to find it, and who the audience is.
I think also we might mention that when you read something, it's not only important for it to be easy to absorb and digest, but we want to comprehend it, and we want the precise idea or meaning that the writer intended to be what we comprehend. So that connection between, oh, it's easy for me, great, but what if you totally misunderstood the intent or the meaning of it? Then it wasn't an accurate read, right? So in my view, for something to be readable, it needs to be also comprehensible. Not just, I know what that sentence says, but I don't really know what it means in the context of the whole piece. In my work with academic writers, I want their writing to be digestible or easy to read, but also precisely comprehensible. And again, what Phil said, the audience for that are going to be people in the education system, whether it's a high school student or a college student or a professor. They're expecting a certain level of readability and comprehensibility. But for me, those two things interact.
How about,
does that make sense to you, Pete?
Yeah, that does make sense, yeah. How about easy to understand for your audience in the text type or genre as a summary?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Yeah.
I would maybe change one of those words from understand to process. If you think of reading as a process, and our brains are like computers going through these words and crunching them into comprehensible ideas. Understand, we can have really difficult concepts. Like if you talk about philosophy or something, you could write it in very plain English and simple text, but it could be still difficult to understand because the concept's hard. Processing the text would be one word I'd change from understand. Okay. But apart from that, I think that nails it.
Sounds good.
The question that raises for me... Yeah. Sorry, Pete, go ahead.
No, go on, Paul.
I was going to say the question that raises for me is, if we have a clear context and level in my case, a college student reading a college essay. So there's an expectation of education level and ability to understand the words and so on. The next question I have is, what is the impediment to the readability that we can adjust, that we can coach? What is going to stop someone from digesting and crunching and processing this document? That's something I'd like to know.
Definitely.
And it's probably different for the different.
Yeah, I think that takes us into different aspects of readability. But just before we go on to that, should we talk about why it's so important? What do you think?
Take it away.
I mean, just in terms of job prospects. So people might not automatically make that link from readability of text to job prospects, but actually it's essential, right? So, if you pitch to an editor, the pitch is crucial for you getting that work. Or for example, I read the other day a LinkedIn top voice in public relations, and she was talking about so her audience are some of her audience at least are employers in the public relations industry, and she was saying how important it is for in the interviewing process and the application process to check candidates' writing. So to ask for writing samples, to check their posts on LinkedIn, to check the email correspondence, to see if they are strong writers. And to be a strong writer, your texts have to be readable. They have to be easy to process for your audience in the type of text you are writing.
It makes sense to me. It stands to reason that, especially if a message is a cold pitch or something which somebody is not expecting, they want to spend as little time as possible reading and understanding it. I guess that's where we all are with our busy digital lives. But I agree too on communication, whatever kind of emails you're sending or stage of the job process you're at, the clearer you can make the writing, and I mean the sort of nuts and bolts of the writing as opposed to the content and the meaning, then that is a good thing and will help your prospects, whether you're a freelancer, professional writer, somebody applying for a job, whatever really. I think it could apply to pretty much everyone who's applying for a job.
Yeah, I like the way you talked about the nuts and bolts there. So we're really talking about the basics here. We're not talking about writing masterpiece, amazing stories. That's obviously important. The ideas, how engaging, how lively you make your writing. All those things are extremely important. But if you don't get the basics right, if your texts are not easy to process, then the other stuff doesn't really matter, right? Because the editor or the employer is not going to read it.
In my case, working with academic students or academic professionals, the connection between the writing and job prospects isn't always self-evident for them. Let's take an undergraduate, a first-year university student asked to write an essay. They might not be thinking about how readable it needs to be in order to get a job. But as a private coach, what I can do is encourage them to see that connection and to see that the process of writing this essay isn't just to get a good grade, but it's to develop the skill of articulating your ideas in a clear, readable way, which is a skill you can translate into tons of different jobs. So it is worth pursuing as a skill. And again, to the nuts and bolts, some of that comes down to grammar and vocabulary, because the person reading it, certainly in my context of academics, has an expectation of how a sentence operates and how an idea is delivered. They're expecting a subject and a verb, right? They're expecting punctuation. And if those nuts and bolts elements of the text are flawed or missing, it's going to impede that readability for that person and affect their understanding, but also in the case of a teacher, affect the grade they deliver. So in terms of the readability, it does come down to the nuts and bolts, doesn't it? It comes down to the linguistic and textual elements. For example, what's easier to read? A 700-word paragraph or 700 words made of 3 paragraphs that are clearly blocked out on the page? Give your mind and your eyes a bit of a break. Little nuts and bolts, technical things like that, I think can help readability and help reduce the impediments to the readability. I think those are good skills to develop as for students that will translate to job prospects.
Yeah, good. Two good points there. If we're looking at aspects now of readability, so one is grammar, good grammar, and the second one is paragraphing. So don't write mega long paragraphs, because straight away, like Phil was saying, when people are busy, they want to process a text quickly. A really dense paragraph, in many cases, again, it does depend on the audience and the text type, but in many cases, a very dense paragraph can put people off even attempting to process, right?
I would say in terms of one nut, so to speak, or one bolt, I'm not sure which one it would be considered, but if we're talking about the formatting of text, it totally depends on where we're finding this text, the context, right? If it is a social media post, obviously we need far more white space. We need lots of breaks and images and things in blogs and headings and different paragraphs, as you say. Interesting, you point out about a long paragraph. I think in general, it's true. That's harder to read and process. But the opposite can also be true. If you're reading a book, and you're ready for deep and meaningful prose, and you find 25 single lines of dialogue, that becomes hard to read. It's like we find it difficult to process the same thing again and again. I think with text, we need variety, but first and foremost I think the ease of formatting is keeping blocks of text to a minimum and to give the reader some kind of eye break between between text.
There is a strictly sort of formatting or visual element to reading, because you're reading with your eyes. So the way it looks can impede readability. The way it looks can aid readability, can't it? White space, font choice, for example.
My advice, just to jump in, Paul, would be for writers to always view what they're going to publish in situ. If you're writing an email for like a mass email send, you need to see how it arrives in your inbox, because it might format differently. Same with the web copy, right? You can write it on a document, but it's like, look at how it appears on screen. We read almost everything that we read now is digital. So if you are writing something which many people will read on their phone, look at it in situ on your phone, because that's the way that you'll be able to assess whether something visually is like working, whether it's readable or not.
That's a good point. So we've got 3 aspects here. Like we've got good grammar, paragraphing, and the third one is presentation and formatting. What about word choice? I wanted to talk a little bit about, if I may. So especially thinking about register here. So choosing, again, depending on the text type and the audience. In many cases, if if we think about copywriting, content writing, press releases, if you're a publicist, if you're a journalist, news articles, you want to keep your language a little less formal, right? Because you want it to be accessible to a broad audience, and therefore you want to avoid words that are overly formal, words that are specialized. So if it's a broad audience, it's not a specialized audience. So make sure you're avoiding words that are specialized and won't be understood by a broad audience. And the other one I'd say is think about frequency. So that's also linked to the other two. So you can, I wanted to actually recommend a couple of tools here. So I've mentioned formality, how specialized, or if something is specialized or non-specialized, and frequency, word frequency. Now, one way you can do this is you can use online dictionaries. So I know that we live in an age of artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, but remember, if you just put something into ChatGPT, it's not totally reliable. So I would actually start with using good online dictionaries, because anyway, if you use something like ChatGPT, you do need to validate, right? So I would have on my computer screen at the top in the tabs, I'd have ready good tools, good online dictionaries. For example, if you use Cambridge Dictionary, you can type in a word that you're not sure, you want to use this word, but you're not sure if this is maybe too formal. Type it in Cambridge monolingual English, and it will actually tell you. So the word will come up, the definition, and by the word, it will say formal, if it's a formal word. So for example, the word mandatory. So I had this with a student the other day. So we were talking about his job, and he said that so he works in public relations, and he was talking about something being mandatory. And actually what he wanted to say was, in the context, was it was something that was extremely important. And so mandatory in that situation, in that context, it came across as overly formal. He was much better using something like, this is a must, something like this, more conversational. So the other one is when words are specialist words. So something like, and this is also, because I know Phil living in Spain, right, in Canary Islands. I'm living in Chile, so we have a lot of experience with differences between English and Spanish. And you've probably noticed how in Spanish, they use a lot of words that in English are specialized, but for them, they use them for broad audiences. But anyway, you can, and this happens, for example, in medical language. So for example, a word like contusion in English, a lot of English native speakers won't know what that means, right?
Or even pathology or something like that. It's something that we wouldn't use in everyday English, talking about
that's a good
medical
one.
problem you have. But,
that's a good one, Phil. Yeah. So yeah, if you put any of these words into Cambridge Dictionary, again, it will give you the definition, but by the word, it will say specialist, right? Specialized. It will say specialized. And also sometimes if you put the word contusion in the Cambridge Dictionary, it will actually say below bruise. So it will give you the synonym, which is, and that synonym is much more appropriate for a broader audience. Anyway, just to finish the last one about word frequency, I recommend Collins Dictionary, because Collins Dictionary, on the right-hand side, you put in the word, and it has these little circles. I think there's 5 of them. And it highlights. So if it's a very frequent word, it will highlight the 5 circles. If it's not frequent at all, like rarely used, it'll only highlight one of the circles. So an example would be, I came across this one: judges exculpated against the accused, exculpated, right? Just sounds really formal. Yeah. So something like drop the charges, judges drop the charges against the accused would be much better for a broader audience.
I was
So
just smirking halfway through that feature, and not because your examples were bad, but I was just imagining that somebody's applying for a job writing about contusions. It's like, how would that? I hope you're not applying for jobs talking about all the bruises you've got and how the charges against you were what was it? Expulcated. I didn't even know that word. Exculpated. There you go. I want to throw it over to Paul. You've got some info for us on what typically people think about readability when we see the word readability. What we think of scores, right? So maybe we can talk about that.
I'll bring that right up in a moment, but I just wanted to add to what Pete said about the word choice. In my context and genre, the academic sphere, almost the opposite is true, because the register is expected to be formal, and the impact that has on word choice is that you are expected to demonstrate your command of specialized words. I'm just thinking of an example here. I've been working with a graduate student studying philosophy, and one of his recent paragraphs included this sentence, and I quote, "Moreover, opening the debate to diverse positions such as idealism, panpsychism, and neutral monism." These are words we would never use walking down the street discussing our bruises or our legal status, but they're important for him to demonstrate his understanding of those specialized concepts in that paper. So had he not used those words, the readability of that paragraph would be diminished, because the reader is expecting those words to be used to point specifically to that idea, those ideas and concepts.
That's a great point.
So we're on kind of the opposite ends of this spectrum of word choice.
Just to really quickly add, sorry, Paul, but because that's a really great point, and I think there are a lot of students who learn English for academic purposes, right? So they take IELTS, they go to a university in the US or UK, New Zealand, Australia, wherever, do a master's, and so that, like you say, that is expected from them, those more formal, specialized words. But then what happens is when if they get a job as a journalist or any kind of job where the audience is a broad audience, it's challenging to adapt your writing style for a different audience. That's just something for our listeners to be aware of. If you had a background learning English more for academic purposes, but then you get a job or you're applying for a job where you're going to be writing for a broad audience, just be aware that you'll need to change your style.
Even in the application, we don't need to be incredibly formal and scholarly. Like, it's better to write an application which somebody can immediately read, understand, and see value in what you're offering, rather than say, hey, this person knows all of the high-level academic words. It's probably not relevant unless you're applying for academia, in which case do use those words.
Even still, it's important for us to remember, and for these learners to remember, that a job opportunity is always really going to come down to the personal interrelationship that you establish in an interview, because the potential employer has to decide, like, if they have 10 candidates and 10 resumes on the table, assume most of them have the base criteria for that job, then it's going to come down to a question of whether or not that employer wants to spend their work days with you. So if you go into an interview and start spouting off about panpsychism, they may get the impression that you're arrogant or condescending and don't want to work with you. So it can really backfire on you if you try to directly bring your academic virtuosity into a job interview. even when I remember applying for a job as an English teacher, I tried to demonstrate the kind of person I was in the interview, not my command of pedagogy, right? Because that person's going to decide whether or not they want to spend their days with you, assuming all other things are equal among the candidates. But let me jump over to this thing, guys, that I want to share with you. One of the things I also do as a part-time job is evaluate writing samples for a test similar to the IELTS and TOEIC test, but it's customized for Canada immigration policy. And one of the scoring elements is readability. Now, I can't disclose the rubric or criteria that we use in that examination, but it's kind of based on this theoretical framework called the Flesch-Kincaid scale. And I want to bring a piece of that up onto the screen here. And this gives us, so the score, on the left we have a score column, and then we have school level where this might be expected, and then notes telling us what level of reader would be expected to be able to read this. And it's based on word frequency, it's based on length of the word, all these factors thrown into the blender of a specific calculus. In my experience, this is informative, but not necessarily useful. However, a lot of testing is based on this readability scale. For example, it ranges from a 5th grade reader who has basic command of reading, and the score they might be expected to manage is 90 to 100. And the description is very easy to read, easily understood by an average 11-year-old student. On the other end of the spectrum, we have a score of like 0 to 30. So it's almost counterintuitive. The lower the score, the more readable, or the more difficult it is. So between 0 and 30 is for a university graduate. And this would be considered very difficult to read, best understood by university graduates. So there's that element of comprehension there, best understood. So does that mean only a university graduate could understand it? Not really. There's a lot of overlap here, I think. Have you guys ever used this or encountered this?
I was going to jump in and talk at length about it, if that's okay, because it's something that's certainly in my wheelhouse. I work with a lot of content writers and copywriters, and this is a mechanical and mathematical way that text can be measured. Is it perfect? Definitely not. And there's a lot that we've already talked about today that contributes to readability that cannot be measured by a machine. This system is basically measuring sentence length. That's a fairly easy one to understand, right? Shorter sentences, easier to read. So if you start breaking up sentences and changing from 25-word sentences to 8-word sentences, your score goes up massively. And that's why in the world of digital content, we're usually told to aim for shorter sentences. And the second element that is used to measure it is word length. But very, very, very importantly, that is about syllable length, the number of syllables, in a word. So it doesn't matter if you have a word like queue, how many words is that? How many letters is that? 5, but it's one syllable, right? Or you could have equally a 5-letter word, possibly with 3 syllables. What makes a word harder to process in English or more challenging is often the number of syllables. So that's what can be measured and determined by this score to be higher or lower. A lot of the time, like more syllables, they are longer, they have more letters, and they're more complex or formal words. They come from Latin, maybe. But if you're seeking to improve readability, either in score or in genuine readability, using more everyday language, which tends to have fewer syllables per word, will help you. The final thing I want to say about this is often people writers or editors put the cart before the horse. They say, your blog needs to have a readability score of 75. So it's super duper easy for, everyone to read, especially if they're a non-native speaker or, a young person. But I think it's something that you should consider after writing your text. Obviously, we make plans and we think, who is this for? What am I writing? So you shouldn't be writing crazily difficult text and then thinking, I have to change everything afterwards. But my point would be, don't sacrifice the expression of your ideas and the quality of your expression, quality of your vocabulary, and the precision of it for a couple of points higher on a readability scale, because there are many things which contribute to whether a text is good or not. And this is simply like one mathematical way that an editor can say, hey, yeah, this passed the test, we can hit publish. So it's useful. Definitely consider word length in terms of syllables and sentence length, but don't put everything on this one score. Sometimes text is great and really easy to read, even if it's got under 50, because it depends, as you said, on the audience and where we find the text.
Just going back to the aspect of syllables, some of my university students have trouble actually recognizing syllables in a word. So I think it's quite useful just for our listeners to just very simply explain how to count syllables in a word. So, for example, I thought of one the other day that is the word rude, right? Rude, something is rude, like a rude post or something, is one syllable, right? But a word like a synonym, objectionable is 5 syllables. The way you can recognize the syllables is each one generally has a vowel sound. So you've got objectionable. So each of those syllables has a vowel sound, and you can count them using your fingers. 5 syllables is quite a lot, isn't it? It's it makes it, like we were talked about before, the more syllables you have in a word, and the more words you have with multiple syllables, the harder it is to process for your readers.
I think one of the problems with this scale too is that it's not necessarily helpful for real world application. For example, the 0 to 30 for a university graduate. Okay, so let's say that university graduate can understand text at that level. Then they go and look for a job. And as we said earlier, in a job interview, they shouldn't be spouting off all kinds of specialized language necessarily, unless it's an academic job maybe, and they have to demonstrate their ability with it. But if they're going to a less specialized job or less directly specialized job, they may want to shift their the readability of things like a resume or even a sample to something less, or something higher on the numerical scale. But for example, this where it says 6th grade level, easy to read, conversational English for consumers. A university graduate sometimes needs to adjust a text down to that level if their audience expands and becomes more general or varied. So maybe we can also say that one should develop the skill of being able to adjust the readability depending on context. Would that be true?
Definitely, yes. It should just be used as a guide for each format that you write in. As I said, typically like an editor of a blog, like a company blog or something might say, right, we need, readability of the score of 70 as a guide. However, that can be impossible to attain if you need to use long words. Those words might be industry relevant, they might be the names of products or brands or something. And if you have to include that several times, it will increase your score, and there's no way to downgrade it. So it should always just be a guide. And yes, generally, higher up the scale is easier to read and better, but don't be led by it too much.
Yeah. And again, if your audience is sophisticated, then they're able to read and comprehend a difficult text. We could say it's easy for them because that's where their skill level is. So part of the readability depends on the reader, doesn't it? It's like a, what do you call that? Interdependent. It's only difficult if the person doesn't have the skill to read it. Don't always know who that person is. I'm going to remove this. But yeah, readability, very interesting. We want readability.
Maybe we can go back to our original question. Now we've sort of answered what readability is, hopefully, and we've touched a bit on it, on how it can boost job prospects. Maybe we should talk a little more to that point.
Yeah, let's do that.
Who wants to start?
Well, I'll kick off because my work's relationship to job prospects is a little less direct. As I mentioned, I'm working with students in academics who may or may not want to go into academics professionally, but what they do need is to develop the ability to write at a high level, adjustable to the audience, because we can assume they're going into some profession that requires writing, or even if it doesn't require writing, speaking at a high level, and developing writing skill will definitely serve speaking skill. So I can't say that increasing readability will get you a job. It'll help you pass your course and get a good score. It'll help a student develop their ability to articulate their ideas and thoughts. It'll help their ability to present them in a text that's readable and understandable. And that can be important for any number of jobs. And I would also say that, again, if they're applying for a job, let's say not in academics, let's say they're not going into a PhD and becoming a professor, but let's say my philosophy writer wants to work at a bank. Well, it's really important for him to develop the ability to present arguments for why or why not somebody should get a bank loan, or for why or why not the bank should invest these funds in some enterprise. And tailor that for the audience. So I think my advice to a student in terms of linking their writing to the job prospects would be developing the ability to adjust the readability for the specific audience. Because if you're at the university level, then it's expected that you're able to write and read at that highest level of, let's say, the Flesch-Kincaid scale. Well, if you can do that, you should also be able to adjust it down to a more readable or conversational level as well. So I like the idea of being dynamic, being a dynamic writer, able to adjust register and readability, which we shouldn't expect from the 5th grade reader who's not there yet. And I think if a writer can do that, develop the ability to write for the university audience, but also for a more conversational audience, that's going to give them more options to use their education to either become a professor or become a manager at Starbucks. Either way, right? That ability to adjust and communicate with all sorts of people in all sorts of contexts. So that's what I would advise my students. develop that dynamic ability.
Yeah, I've got one more which might also be relevant to your students, Paul. I mean, I used to teach a lot of students preparing the IELTS. And if you think about as a second language English writer, you might have a very high level of writing in your first language. So you might be able to write long, complex sentences. I'm not saying you should do that, but you might be able to write longer, more complex sentences in your first language. But what I think happens a lot to students is then when they try to write in English, they try to transfer the expectations from their first language to their second language. So my advice would be, know your level, right? So, for example, if you have an A2 or B1, I don't know how many of our listeners have those levels, but let's say B1. So B1 is an intermediate level. You shouldn't be too ambitious with the complexity of your writing. You should start with, like Phil was talking about, the nuts and bolts. Keep the sentences fairly simple. Go for that high readability score. Because then you can build on that. You can always then, as you get more advanced in your English writing, you can then start to add more variety, vary the sentence lengths. And then, because there's a balance between what is readable and what is engaging, right? You can be extremely readable and very boring, right? But that's okay at the start. When you're like a B1, A2, B1 level, don't be too self-demanding. Aim for readability first. That would be my advice.
I'll just finish up by saying, my advice to a lot of people I work with, freelancers, content copywriters, people pitching for work would be differentiate between your portfolio and the pitches that you put out, or the communication you have with prospective clients. Your portfolio should be effective writing, and that often is like high-level, deep, cool articles and like really effective blogs that you can share. And when you actually write to people saying, hey, are you interested? Or hey, I've got this idea, or hey, I'd like to apply to this position, keep it looking incredibly simple, because they're probably going to be spending like 1.5 seconds reading your message. So everything should be as readable as possible, with all of those aspects that we talked about: short sentences, shorter words, and clear formatting. It's always down to what makes writing effective. That changes, but I think one of the big ones is readability. And hopefully, gents, we covered it today. What do you reckon?
I think so.
Yeah, I think we covered that quite well.
All right. Let's leave it there then, and we can all go to the pub, apart from Paul, because it's the morning for him.
Yeah, it's the morning.
Cheers,
think
guys.
of me when you're tilting your pint.
Will do.
I'll get to it. All right, guys.
All right. Well, thanks,
Good chat, everyone.
listeners, for tuning in.
Yep. See you next time.
See you next time.
See ya. Bye.